Most people believe influence is something you either have or you don't, like a trait you're born with. But that belief alone quietly keeps them invisible, because influence is not a gift. It's a system, one that operates whether you understand it or not. And if you want to master the kind of presence that shapes decisions, moves people, and creates opportunities, then subscribe now, because what you're about to hear will change the way you see every conversation, every interaction, and even your own behavior. The truth is, every day you are either influencing or being influenced. There is no neutral ground, and the moment you step into a room, whether physical or digital, there is a silent exchange happening beneath the surface, a psychological negotiation where attention, trust, authority, and perception are constantly shifting, like pieces on a chessboard, and most people don't even realize they are playing, which is exactly why they lose before the game even begins. Think about it like this: in a world driven by choices, the person who can guide decisions without force holds a level of power that doesn't need to announce itself. It simply operates. And this is where the principles from the book, Influence, the Psychology of Persuasion, quietly reshape everything you thought you knew, because the book reveals that human behavior is not as random as it appears. It follows patterns, predictable triggers that, once understood, allow you to move with precision instead of guesswork. And one of the most powerful of these is reciprocity. The idea that when you give something of value first, people feel a natural pull to give something back. But here's where most people misunderstand it. They think it's about giving more, when in reality, it's about giving strategically, giving in a way that feels genuine, but also intentional, like a chess player sacrificing a piece not to lose, but to gain position. And if you observe closely, the most influential individuals don't rush to demand attention. They create value first, they listen deeply, they understand context, and then they respond in a way that makes the other person feel seen. And that feeling alone builds a foundation stronger than any forced persuasion. Now consider another principle, social proof, which operates like an invisible signal in the human mind, guiding people toward what others are already doing, because uncertainty makes people look outward for direction. And this is why environments matter more than motivation, because if you place yourself in circles where discipline, focus, and growth are the norm, your behavior begins to align with that standard without constant effort. But if you remain in spaces where distraction and mediocrity dominate, you will find yourself slowly adapting to that rhythm, not because you chose it consciously, but because influence works silently. And this is where awareness becomes your greatest advantage, because once you see these patterns, you stop being pulled unconsciously and start positioning yourself deliberately. There's a subtle story that plays out in the life of someone who understands this shift. Someone who once spoke and felt ignored, who once shared ideas that seemed to disappear into silence, but instead of becoming louder, they became sharper. They started observing how people respond when they lean in, when they disengage, what captures attention and what loses it. And over time, they adjusted not their authenticity, but their delivery, their timing, their framing. And slowly, almost quietly, something changed. People began to listen, not because the message was louder, but because it was aligned with how the human mind naturally receives information. And this is the transformation most people miss, because they focus on what to say instead of how and when to say it. Now think about commitment and consistency, another principle that operates like a psychological anchor. Once people make a small commitment, they are far more likely to stay consistent with it. And this is why the most effective communicators don't start with massive demands. They start small. They guide people step by step, building momentum, because influence is not about forcing a leap. It's about guiding a path. And you can apply this immediately in your own life, whether you're building a personal brand, leading a team, or simply trying to be heard. Start by creating small agreements, small moments where people align with you, because each one strengthens the connection and increases the likelihood of deeper engagement later. And then there's authority, not the loud forced version, but the quiet kind that comes from clarity, from understanding your subject deeply enough that you don't need to prove it constantly, because true authority doesn't seek validation. It demonstrates value, and people naturally gravitate toward that. But here's the key. Authority is not just about knowledge. It's about how that knowledge is communicated, structured, and delivered. Because even the most powerful idea can remain invisible if it's not presented in a way that resonates. And this is where many people struggle. They assume that being right is enough, but influence requires more than accuracy. It requires alignment with how people think, feel, and decide. Scarcity is another force that shapes perception. When something feels limited, its value increases not always because it is inherently better, but because the possibility of losing it creates urgency. And you see this everywhere, in opportunities, in time, in attention. But the deeper understanding is this: your own time and focus are also scarce. Resources and the way you treat them signals your value to others. Because if you are constantly available, constantly reactive, constantly giving without structure, people begin to perceive your presence as less valuable, not out of disrespect, but because the human mind assigns value based on perceived rarity. And this is why disciplined individuals protect their time, not to isolate themselves, but to maintain the integrity of their focus. Now layer all of this together and you start to see a pattern. Influence is not a single skill. It's a system of awareness, positioning, and execution. It's understanding human psychology at a level where your actions are no longer random, they are intentional. And this doesn't mean manipulating people. It means communicating in a way that aligns with how people naturally operate. And there's a difference between force and alignment. Force creates resistance. Alignment creates momentum. And the person who understands this moves through life with a level of effectiveness that others often mistake for luck. But here's where it becomes practical. Because without application, all of this remains theory. So start with observation. Pay attention to conversations. Notice what captures attention, what creates engagement, what leads to agreement. Then move to calibration. Adjust your communication based on feedback, not emotionally, but strategically. Treat each interaction as data, and then refine your approach. And finally, implement consistently, because influence is not built in a single moment. It's built through repeated aligned actions over time. Like training a muscle, each repetition strengthens your ability to connect, to guide, to lead. And as you continue to develop this awareness, something subtle begins to shift. You start to notice that influence is not about controlling others. It's about controlling your own presence, your own clarity, your own discipline. Because when those are aligned, your impact naturally expands. And the people who once overlooked you begin to notice, not because you demanded attention, but because your presence now carries weight. And that weight is not loud, it's not aggressive, it's controlled, it's precise, it's intentional, and it leaves an impression that lingers even after you've left the room. And as this continues, you begin to realize that the real question was never whether influence is possible, but whether you are willing to understand and apply the principles that make it inevitable. And that willingness is where the separation quietly begins. Because most people like the idea of influence. They like the image of being heard, respected, and followed. But they resist the discipline required to build it. And influence, at its core, is a disciplined practice, not a moment of inspiration. It is built in the small, often unnoticed decisions, like choosing to pause instead of react, choosing to listen instead of react, choosing to listen instead of interrupt, choosing to observe instead of assume. And those choices compound over time into something that feels almost invisible to others, but becomes undeniable in its effect. And there's another layer here that most never explore deeply enough, which is liking, a principle that seems simple on the surface, but is far more strategic than it appears. Because people are naturally drawn to those they feel connected to. But connection is not about trying to be liked by everyone. It's about creating genuine points of alignment, shared perspectives, shared values, shared understanding. And when that alignment is real, not forced, it creates a level of trust that no amount of persuasion alone can achieve. And this is why the most effective communicators don't try to dominate conversations. They guide them, they create space. They allow others to feel involved, and in doing so, they build influence without resistance. Now imagine this like a battlefield where most people charge forward with noise and urgency, while a few step back, study the terrain, understand the patterns of movement, and then act with precision. Those few don't need to move as often. But when they do, their actions carry weight, and that is exactly how influence operates when it is mastered. It becomes efficient, it becomes focused, it becomes intentional, and it no longer relies on constant effort. Because it is aligned with how people naturally respond. And yet, there is a tension here, a subtle challenge that tests whether someone truly understands influence or is simply imitating it. Because once you begin to see these principles, there is a temptation to use them mechanically, to apply them without depth, to treat them like shortcuts. But influence without authenticity loses its power quickly, because people may not always understand why something feels off, but they feel it, and that feeling creates distance. So the real mastery comes from integrating these principles into who you are, not layering them on top as a technique. And that integration requires self-awareness, it requires honesty, it requires the willingness to refine not just how you communicate, but how you think. And this is where the hidden story continues, because the individual who once struggled to be heard begins to realize that influence is not about becoming someone else. It's about becoming more precise, more intentional, more aligned with their own values while understanding the psychology of others. And in that process, they begin to remove what is unnecessary, the over-explaining, the need for constant validation, the scattered focus, and what remains is clarity. And clarity has a way of cutting through noise in a way that effort alone never can. Now bring this into a real-world scenario. Imagine you are presenting an idea, whether to a team, an audience, or even a single person. Instead of starting with complexity, you begin with clarity. A simple, strong foundation that is easy to understand, because the human mind resists confusion but moves toward clarity. Then you build gradually, layering information in a way that feels natural, almost like guiding someone step by step through a path they didn't even realize they were following. And along the way, you reinforce key points, not by repeating them mechanically, but by showing them from different angles, allowing them to settle into understanding. And by the time you reach your main point, it no longer feels like persuasion. It feels like a natural conclusion, something the other person has arrived at themselves. And that is one of the most powerful forms of influence, because people trust conclusions they feel they have reached on their own. And as you refine this approach, you begin to see that timing becomes just as important as content, because even the right message delivered at the wrong moment loses its impact. And this is why awareness is not just about understanding principles, it's about reading situations, reading people, sensing when to speak, when to pause, when to push forward, and when to step back. And this level of awareness cannot be rushed. It is developed through attention, through presence, through the willingness to engage fully in the moment instead of operating on autopilot. And then there is the principle of unity, a deeper layer that connects everything together. Because when people feel that you are on the same side, that you understand their perspective, that you are aligned with their goals, resistance drops naturally. And this is not about pretending to agree with everything, it's about finding genuine points of connection and building from there. Because influence is strongest when it feels collaborative, not confrontational. And this is where many people unknowingly create barriers. They focus on proving themselves right instead of creating alignment. And in doing so, they push others away instead of drawing them in. But when you begin to shift this approach, when you focus on alignment first, something changes. Conversations become smoother, ideas flow more easily, and the need to force outcomes begins to disappear, because the environment you create supports the direction you want to go. Now consider how all of this applies beyond conversations into your daily habits, your routines, your environment. Because influence is not limited to how you speak, it is reflected in how you live, the way you manage your time, the way you prioritize your goals, the way you handle challenges. All of these send signals, not just to others, but to yourself, reinforcing a standard that either strengthens or weakens your influence over time. And this is where discipline becomes the foundation, because without discipline, influence becomes inconsistency, and inconsistency erodes trust, both internally and externally. And as you continue to build this, there's a moment, often subtle, where you realize that influence is no longer something you are trying to achieve. It is something you are expressing naturally, because your actions, your words, and your presence are aligned, and that alignment creates a kind of quiet authority that does not need to announce itself. It is felt, it is recognized, and it creates opportunities that were not available before, not because the world suddenly changed, but because your interaction with it did. And yet, even at this stage, there is another layer waiting, Because true mastery is not static. It evolves, it deepens, it requires continuous refinement. And this is where most people plateau. They reach a level of competence and stop pushing further. But influence, like any skill, rewards those who continue to observe, continue to learn, continue to adapt. Because the environment is always changing, people are always changing, and staying effective requires staying aware. So you begin to challenge yourself, not just to apply what you know, but to expand it, to test it in different contexts, to refine it under pressure, to maintain clarity even in complexity. And this process builds a level of confidence that is not based on external validation, but on internal consistency. The knowledge that you can enter any situation, understand the dynamics, and respond with precision. And as this continues, you start to see influence not as a tool, but as a responsibility. Because the ability to guide decisions, to shape perspectives, to impact outcomes carries weight, and how you use that ability defines the kind of impact you create, whether it builds trust or erodes it, whether it creates value or simply extracts it. And this awareness adds another layer of discipline, because now it is not just about what works, but about what aligns with your principles. And somewhere within all of this, there is a realization that changes everything. A realization that influence is not about being seen by everyone, it is about being seen by the right people in the right way at the right time, and that requires patience, it requires focus, it requires the willingness to remain consistent, even when the results are not immediate, because the most powerful forms of influence often build quietly before they become visible. And when they do, they appear almost effortless, even though they are the result of sustained intentional effort over time. And that is where the question begins to shift again. From how do you gain influence to how do you sustain and expand it without losing the clarity and discipline that built it in the first place? Because that is where the next level begins to reveal itself. And that is where the final shift happens, the one most people never fully reach. Because sustaining influence is not about doing more. It's about becoming sharper, more intentional, more selective, understanding that not every moment requires your voice, not every space deserves your energy, and not every opportunity aligns with your direction. Because true influence is not measured by how often you are seen, but by how deeply you are felt when you choose to show up. And when you reach this level, something changes in the way you move. You stop chasing attention and start commanding presence. You stop trying to convince and start creating clarity. You stop reacting and start directing. And this is where influence becomes less about strategy and more about identity. Because the principles you once practiced now operate within you naturally, guiding your decisions, shaping your communication, refining your focus. And people begin to notice, not because you demand recognition, but because your consistency makes you impossible to ignore. Your words carry weight because they are backed by discipline. Your actions create trust because they are aligned with intention, and your presence leaves an impression because it is controlled, precise, and deliberate. And in a world where noise is constant and attention is scattered, this level of clarity becomes rare, and rarity creates value, and value creates influence, not the loud kind that fades quickly, but the quiet kind that builds momentum over time. The kind that opens doors, creates opportunities, and shifts outcomes without force. And the deeper you understand this, the more you realize that influence was never about changing others. It was about mastering yourself first, your focus, your discipline, your awareness. Because when those are in place, everything else begins to align. Conversations become more effective, decisions become more intentional, and your path becomes more defined. And at that point, the choice becomes clear, not as a dramatic moment, but as a quiet decision you make daily, to either remain passive in a world that is constantly shaping you, or to step forward with awareness and intention, shaping your own direction, and in doing so, influencing the environment around you. Because invisibility is not a lack of ability, it is a lack of intentional presence. And the moment you begin to apply what you now understand, consistently, deliberately, without distraction, you step out of that invisibility and into a space where your voice carries, your actions matter, and your influence becomes something that is not forced, not temporary, but built on a foundation that continues to grow stronger with time. And as you move forward with that awareness, you begin to see that this is not an endpoint, it is a standard, one that demands continuous refinement, continuous discipline, continuous clarity. Because the moment you stop evolving, influence begins to fade. But if you stay aligned, if you stay intentional, if you stay aware, then what you build does not just remain, it expands, it compounds, and it begins to shape outcomes far beyond what most people ever imagine. And that is where mastery truly begins.